enjoyed our talk with Ebert the other day. That was magnificent. So thank you for making the time. And I'm looking forward to going through it again. I think that's such a critical topic. And Daniel, it is good to see you. I have been editing our work on the book, trying to get the thoughts out for the story. Grass has been growing like crazy this summer because it's raining so much and then getting sunny. So I feel like I'm weed eating every other day. So I will be weed eating again this evening. But no, we are doing well. And Daniel, good to see you. I'd be curious what anyone is thinking about anything in any way whatsoever. I have been editing kind of different parts of different things, but I'd be curious if anyone's thinking about anything.
I'll just hello Daniel, hello Thomas.
Good to see you,
How's it going? It's
Daniel.
good to see you. Um, Michael. Oh yeah. This I suppose I'm thinking about your contribution at Philosophy Portal the other day in the when the rapping was going on. Um, that I was trying to think about your thinking, and my impression was that like you there's like a core idea in your thought. I think it's somewhere around this A B logic. And what really impressed me in the instance was like the way in which you implicate many context in that. So like the way that you were able to speak about rapping in this very functional, practical way about how it might frame an individual coming to speech um, uh, by this different logic. Yeah. So I guess that's just the one thought. And otherwise, I've been thinking about war and and too muchness, like just the absurdity and um nonsense. But yeah, that's a scattershot there.
No, Cypher, war, and too muchness go together perfectly because there's something about learning to sublimate violence into speak or libidinal that if you can't do, you end up in war. So there's actually some lovely connections there because those things kind of go together in different ways. But I would certainly, it was funny being there because Bernard and I did so much work on Cypher mentality, Cypher tank. We had this where we'd gather kids because the idea of like, oh, boardroom meetings or these think tanks, these are basically just ciphers, hip hop ciphers slowed down. And actually, if you were to create a hip hop, you might get more of a creative energy. You might get more creativity. In all of these businesses, we had the Tom Tom Festival in Charlottesville. There was a lot of people referring to Charlottesville as the Silicon Valley of the East Coast. So we had all these people that were interested in that kind of work. And it was like, oh, well, let's get Bernard did a lot of work at Abundant Life. It's like, well, let's get these kids that are really good at freestyle and put them in the boardroom, and that will be like the ultra creative energy. Actually, the ultimate, because it's when you're because you can't lie in improvisation. Like there's something uninhibited about improvisation where ideas are going to come out in such a powerfully effective manner. So that was the idea. And Bernard gave that TED talk on spreading escaping binary thinking for, we called it cipher mentality, which is going to be A-B logic. It is not going to just be the idea is that school teaches you linear logic. It teaches you, Jockin and I were speaking the other day with Ebert on truth as correspondence theory of truth. But there is something about the hip hop cipher that is truth as an unveiling. It's coming out and veiling at the same time. It's this live process that's going on. And our idea was, well, subjectivity is structured by language profoundly. So if you can afford people different ways of using language, that will create different subjectivity. That will create different ways that people carry themselves in the world. So if you're having, so kind of a lot of it was too, is like, well, if you're having all these major social, political, economic problems, well, maybe it's the way people are. Maybe it's the kind of subjects people are that different uses of language would actually unlock and open them up to. Bernard and I worked at Eunoia with Evan. I could name Jess, many, many people. He taught and did a lot of work on Daniel Pink's A Whole New Mind, Drive, all of these ideas of back then the dialogue was right brain thinking versus left brain, which it's interesting because now you have McGilchrist coming up, which reminds me a lot of Daniel Pink, and we would talk on Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And there was this idea that a lot of the economic problems and social problems you were seeing was a lack of quote unquote right brain thinking, a lack of creativity. And the thesis was, well, what if there was something about the cipher, hip hop, and art that changes how you relate to language, changes how you actually think, that would actually practically impact subjects to actually make them more ready for the world, actually. Able to actually meet the problems we're dealing with that can't be predicted ahead of time. Because the whole idea of the cipher is you don't know what's coming. You have to just be able to go with it, right? We did it a lot. We had Pitchcraft in Tom Tom. We had an improv comedian, Ziggy. He came. There were all these. We had all these improv people that would teach Pitchcraft and so on. And I'll spread this. Anyone can speak, please, on anything. So really, the kind of nugget is that there is a way that people carried themselves that was at the root of many of the problems. Now, there are people today who are talking about the poly crisis is due to the meta crisis, that there's an underlying crisis that is manifesting in many, many different crises. In a way, you might overlay it with that, on the thinking of the lack of cipher mentality, which is absolutely AB logic, but this was before I knew Hegel or anyone like that. That this was leading to the inability of the subject to deal with the complexity that we were faced with, and so on and so forth. And absolutely, the movement from AA to AB is at the heart, you could say, of OG Rose. That is absolutely. It's funny because for about 15 years, there was this paper I kept going back to on A is A, and just kept going back to it on the issue of A is A. And what just befuddled me is how obviously true AA was, and yet how obviously insufficient it was. And I couldn't pin that down. I was like, how do you question this? Obviously A is A. But it was like, but there's a problem here. This will sound odd, but someone gave me Atlas Shrugged. Ayn Rand is big on A is A. Her whole project has this A is A logic. But then, she was in a terrible sexual situation with one of her students. It destroyed her marriage, like this kind of horrible thing. So it was this idea of like the whole thinking of Ayn Rand. I'm like, well, this is very internally consistent. It all follows, and yet there seems to be something dramatically left out in her thinking, which I would associate with actually sexuality. I think that kind of came to bite her. Not to get into all of that. But, there were other thinkers where I was like, well, when you look at a cup, surely it's a cup. But then the idea of a cup is not the same as the object of a cup. And yet the only way I refer to A is through an idea of a thing that it is not. So what's going on? So the formula for me became A is A must mean A does not equal A equals A does not equal A without B. Becomes kind of the bigger formula, and this is the main paper of reconstructing A as A. And Clayton, good to see you, sir. And that ultimately was the idea that things are themselves while being simultaneously experienced as something they are not, that points to something they are without, and this is the logical form of intelligibility. And ultimately, this is the truth. This was kind of the key paper. It's in the Reconstructing A as A. I would say the main papers are the papers AA, the paper of the problem of indestructible maps, the problem of internally consistent systems, the map is indestructible, and the conflict of mind. Those 4 papers are kind of the epistemological core, which ultimately will lead outside to the questions of things like beauty, sociology, and so on and so forth. So that's underlying. And for me, the hip-hop cipher, as I got to know Bernard, the hip-hop cipher was a use of language and social engagement in a manner that pointed to A is A as A does not equal A equals A does not equal A without B. Now, I'd have to unpack that formula, but it is at the root of a whole lot. So let me give it to Mr. Jockin and then back to you, Daniel. Mr. Jockin, please.
So since I'm on summer break, I got to be jumping on all these different courses. So one of the courses this conversation reminded me of was on Plato's Timaeus, typically the concept of hora, basically a kind of absent space or place, sometimes it's translated as. And then specifically, it's interesting, it's a good example of, Danny, you made a comment to me before, I'm like this thinker of difference because I'm sitting with is a Derrida group. So it's actually very interesting in terms of it's a very different place in me of where my thought is. So it's first we're reading Timaeus, and then we're reading Derrida's reading of Timaeus in this section. And I think that actually the big part that Derrida is grabbing onto, you could see him just grabbing onto it with such a significance of point, is the problem of naming. that's what he's grabbing onto, in the sense of this kind of, the whole point is that, wait, at first it's like, well, wait a minute, Plato presents to you as like, well, not really, but Plato has Timaeus present to you. Notice it's not Socrates, it's Plato. This point about the kind of eidos that is always present, that is never changing, is universal, and no, versus the eidos that's always becoming. This third one, then it's the hora. So it's the receptacle, the space in which things come to be. And so it's like what's going on is this motion of dialectic of two contraries are being presented with a third, which is this hora. And then what Derrida's grabbing onto is even this naming. And he goes into this very particular point about not calling it the hora, as is the particularity, which is very different from Plato's move of the beautiful or the good, for example. So you can see really interesting moves about an emphasis of naming. I'm just saying that I'm bringing this up because, right, this, and that's the thing, is like Plato does talk about this, what you just brought up, Daniel, the whole point of Critias is that names signify, point to something that's by something other than it. Yet it's a very bizarre kind of catch. Plato doesn't give a clear answer in that one. Timaeus seems to give a better initiation, beginning point about this. Also, what's fun is, so prior to this section of Timaeus, there's a prior section where it's actually it's a 4-term relationship, not 3, mainly because it's not just, it's the eidos of the undivided and always the case, the eidos of the coming to be and divided, which is then blended into a third eidos, which then, and this is where I got very fun, is that then those are then forced by violence into an idea, right? So it's actually a 4-term relationship going on in that earlier section of Timaeus. All right, I'm just bringing this up because I do think it's interesting that another course I'm taking right now is on cybernetics with Heidegger. So I'm reading that course now. And so basically this is Insight. So Insight seminars, they got me dug in all this summer. What is interesting about that, actually there's another cybernetic course related to memory that I'm a part of too. So I'm bringing all this up just to say, it is interesting that the dispositional state, a diathesis, that's also why I'm bringing this up, because hora gets taught as place, but it's this very generic place, receptacle place. But there's also different kinds of place in Greek. There's hora, then there's diathesis, and then there's topos, which is interesting because because obviously you're seeing through thesis and topos as in topic. It's not that far of an accident. Look, it's interesting how these positions in space have or talk about as thought. It's just very fascinating, that move right there. I'm bringing this up is that the names we use do change the dispositional state of the person using the name. This has actually been the entire field. There's entire mystical religious practices around this whole point. The divine names of Pseudo Dionysus, or the names of the beautiful names of God in the Islamic tradition. I just find that very interesting that there's this intuition about naming, that it's something other, yet it has this very power of basically almost a cybernetic feedback mechanism of regulation, that by the interjection of a name, there's a kind of dispositional change that occurs by what names we use. So I just wanted to share those notes. I think that's quite interesting. I'll stop there.
Well, I think there are so many traditions that have this idea that naming is a big deal. Is that if you name something, it starts a kind of feedback loop. What a person is named, then they make themselves in the image like, which then kind of goes back and forth. That naming is not, you can't separate the naming from the thing. And that was part of kind of the paper, is the idea of a cup by which the phenomenon is known has this sort of, participatory structure in it. It has some sort of changing of the orientation to the thing. And that has to be very taken seriously. If you say that transformation is arbitrary or not real, that seems kind of problematic, because you're kind of positing the possibility of meaningful relation without, say, words or concepts, and that doesn't seem possible. Or it seems like a complete hypothetical. I'll give it to Daniel here, but one of this idea with the hip hop is the way language is used and how things are referred to changes. It is a kind of place. It is a kind of space. Because the cipher is a kind of space. When all the guys come together to form a circle, this is a space within a space, and it changes the kind of orientation. And that space is afforded, though, by people doing the work and having the openness to create this space, right? So there's a certain condition that has to be met. And if it is met, there is a new relation to language that can, well, create a feedback loop in how people relate to that language. It changes how they think about it. And there is something about, well, it is interesting. You're talking about naming. Always like Walker Percy says that a novel is a poem that can go by no other, it's a poem that can go no shorter, right? Like you had to do the entire novel to get, I'm sorry, it's a metaphor that can't go any shorter. There's a way in which an entire process is a kind of christening, a kind of naming, a kind of laying things out that changes how they are approached. And once you change your towardness to reality, that opens a new feedback loop. So language is very, very important. And I could not, and to me, the excess of A is A, the lack that suggested in excess was the naming itself, was the use of language, was the use of concepts itself. The A on one side of the equal sign was not the same as the A on the other side of the equal sign. However, A is an incredibly useful model, and I would not, this is not saying one does not use it. It's just that the formula unfolds into A is not A equals A is not A without B. Now, of course, all of that has to be expanded on, but it ultimately, without me knowing it at the time, is trying to get at a truth that is an unveiling in the kind of Heideggerian sense as we were talking about, this ever process that is unveiling, that is nevertheless true, and nevertheless provides a certain stability, but it is in the unfolding across the equal sign, if you will. That's at least some of Daniel's early, 21-year-old self in a library or a back alley somewhere when they kicked me out of IHOP. But let me give it to Daniel. Daniel, please.
No, that's great. It feels like it's really a rich terrain, and like the language that Thomas you gave us in terms of the core of the thesis and the topos, like this like spatial naming as being part of what it gives the very the place from which you move and the place in which you consider yourself, and then these other seeds of war. Like I'm wondering if that can come in like quite specifically how we think about that in relation to the AA or to AA logic. I'm definitely going to return to that formula that you came to there, Daniel, in terms of yeah, I'm going to have to return to the recording. But I guess if I could like provoke with the question, it would be putting this spatial naming or speaking of war. Then we have the idea of hip hop or like a cipher tank, which uses language differently. And then this idea that was raised in terms of like when is it reinforcement and when is it releasing? So when are we like I was looking at some like very just a racist person's Instagram account, and I was looking for a while, like plus 20 minutes, and just there's like a logic to his worldview, or he has ideas and he has this catchphrase that it's just a pattern recognition. And also it was just a deeply frustrating day, so I was frustrated, and then I'm walking down the street and I'm rapping, or I'm just letting language kind of go, and it is this kind of exposed state. It is quite naked when you get into a flow state, because now language is playing off itself, and it's kind of revealing its own structure. But that structure is not like an abstract universal. It's having to do with what I've consumed, with what I'm thinking, with what I feel. So then maybe it like gets quite explicit and then like nasty even. Like that's coming out. How, yeah, I mean, it's different in an individual practice, and then say like a group setting that changes the dynamic. But I guess I'm just kind of fleshing out the general area or the question of this the practice of naming in the context of war, speaking about war, and then the question of like reinforcing or releasing, and how do we get that right?
Well, I think that's a tremendous question because, one of the things, again, Bernard and I would talk about a lot is how, writing stories, writing novels, you'll notice sometimes that there's a lot of darkness in fiction. There's murder, there's blood, there's terrible things can come out in art. And there's one way where there's always the concern. Notably, we were working with, say, religious artists, Christian artists who would say, we're not Christian artists, we're artists who are Christian because they didn't want to do propaganda. But, if your story has a murder in it or it has a sex scene or something like that, there's this idea that you're reinforcing it. And there's this idea that, yeah, you don't want to just have shock value for shock. So you have to learn the art of storytelling and when certain violence is justified. When are you elevating versus when are you sublating it, like the real of human reality, right? Because there's another issue where the creative act, I think a lot of this question of reinforcement versus sublimating, actually, this is where a society really needs the arts and creative activity, because the creative activity can be a processing of these things to help you think through, because you see these characters who are in a hateful relationship, or if you write stories of characters who are in affairs, you say, oh, I can see how people end up in an affair. If you don't actually write the story, you might just be judgmental, be like, I would never do that, I'd never be in an affair, and that's precisely what sets you up to be in one, right? Like, I always found writing out stories helps me see myself as a sinner, as not a perfect person. And that was actually really important, because if I didn't do that process, I didn't actually believe it, because I didn't understand the logic of how it occurred. So there's always been something about, but was I saying that affairs are good in writing a story about an affair? Was I reinforcing it? No, I was working through the logic to see how it occurs, to humanize it for my own sake, you could say, so I myself don't get caught up in that logic. Now, there are also questions of art for you and art for the public, right? There are different techniques. Like if you have a story about an affair that is going to be for the public, there is a certain thinking of how is this presented in a manner that is not glorifying it. And then you're going to get into the skills of irony, the skills of technique, the skills of perspective. Like, I do think the difference between art for one's own sublimation and art for the public is a world of difference. And I think many people can disagree with that. They can go that, no, art should just be an expression. And it depends. It depends. But there is something to be said. I do think good art, let me actually say something maybe large. I think good art almost by definition avoids reinforcement because it tends to be ironic, tragic, and interesting. If it's good art, it doesn't give you an answer. It gives you multiple people who are living multiple worldviews and the interconnection and the way those things relate. And I'll pass it to Clayton here in a minute, like a Brothers Karamazov. Like good art, almost by definition, avoids this problem because it is trying to show a condition that we find ourselves in. Well, we could say it tries to create a space. More than it tries to create a space of wrestling more than a prescription. So if you are writing for the public and it is good art, it kind of, now again, this is a giant claim, I think it kind of naturally avoids the reinforcement problem. Now, we could also get into the difference between music, the difference between novels, the difference between lyrics and all of these different things. But I think the same can happen, like you mentioned, like we're talking about hip hop. I think a good hip hop album also has a multivalence to it also. Like if it's just a hip hop that is reinforcing a same idea, it's not nearly as interesting as hip hop like you'll see in a Lamar, where it will be going from song to song on different takes and revisitings of different things, right? So this question of reinforcement versus sublation, I think varies based on if it's the individual for the individual or if it's for the public. Because in a way, they're different spaces. Like they're different spaces and therefore they call forth for different uses of language. But it is a very tremendous question. But this would be my caveat. A lot of people will say that art is fundamentally therapeutic, that just doing art will be fundamentally therapeutic. and it will avoid these problems. But this is where I think what is the point of art is important. Because if you're just sitting down writing all of your rage, that could be reinforcement. But if you know that good art ultimately has to point to tragedy or the irony or the beautiful, then you're going to have to direct that rage toward a realistic situation that will direct it toward the beautiful. And now it can sublate. I don't think merely expressing your darkness will necessarily address it. That could be reinforced, but that's where philosophy comes in. And this is where Bernard and I were like, you can't separate art and philosophy because you have to ask the telos. You have to ask, what is the art toward, right? And if you don't have that question, then you don't know what space you're in. Ultimately, you don't know what space you're in. And if you don't know what space you're in, you don't know what feedback loop you're engaged in. Because that's also what's the difference between the reinforcement feedback loop and the sublative feedback loop that can move toward the beautiful, right? Well, there are a difference in space, a difference in the kind of being that is being put forth. So you have to ask those questions on what is it pointing toward. And this is where I appreciate someone like a Harold Bloom emphasizing that good literature has irony. I agree. We have to talk about what irony is. Great literature is kind of gesturing towards something apathetic. I agree. It seems to have that sort of trajectory to not just be reinforcement. But I will stop and give it to Clayton. And I am praying my internet is working, but I will give it to Clayton. That's always the fun part in Zoom. You have no idea, right? You're talking and it's like you've been frozen for 30 minutes. You have no idea. But let me give it to Clayton. Clayton, it is always a pleasure to see you, sir. Thank you for coming.
This is a very interesting subject for me because I'm currently working on training like an LLM and playing with like language models and neural nets and things like that. And from everything that's been contributed, like, you know, what Jockin said about the spatial naming, that was really alive for me because I watch this guy, Grant Sanderson. He has a YouTube channel called Three Blue and Brown, where he tries to visualize the inner workings of, you know, like a language model, how it works. And in one of his, you'd say, visualizations, he tries to demonstrate, like, if a language model is learning, what is it learning to do? And what it's trying to do is to learn to predict in a spatial way what would come next in whatever direction you went of a specific word. And this is quite fascinating because in one of the examples he says, if it's trying to figure out how, you know, what gender object would be associated to something called king, it has to use the relation of what is related to man, right? And then it would look at what's related to boy, and then it would figure out that maybe queen would be the thing that would be related to king. And but it's doing this in a special way, like, because for everyone word, it could go in several directions, could have multiple relations. And so for me, I find that quite fascinating because when you look at English is you'd say a hyper normalized language. And what I mean by that is, like, it's very fine grained, like it has been broken down to much smaller components, that the relationships are they're much less analogical, they are more logical. So when you're processing something in English, that's why English works well for programming and for mathematics and for science, because it's very differentiated to allow for logic. Like there's a name for almost every scenario. Now, why I say that is, like, in languages that are not as developed as say English, like my native language, which is Eunoia, you'll find that the language is very dense, right? It's very dense in that the phrase has this whole layer of context and intonation and emotion built in. So just because someone said something is not sufficient to know what they meant. You still have to investigate what was the scenario, how did they say it, who did they say it to. All that extra information tells you what it means. And so you find that we have several phrases and several words that, depending on how you use it, it means completely something different. And depending on which dialect, because there are several dialects within like a tribe, and then is it an adult speaking to a child, or is it a child speaking to an adult? Is it male to female? Is it male to male? Depending on that combination, the meaning is different. And so it still goes back to the whole spatial thing. It's like it's kind of like you're using language as a map to navigate this space of meaning, to just track where you are. And when you throw in the whole telos thing, it also reminds me of what I'm sort of like calling the Goldilocks rule, with the trying to identify the just right. Yeah, it's like it's tricky. I always try to throw this one in of does God have a left hand? Right? Like God doesn't really have a left hand. God only has a right hand, and you still have to always tune to where is that right, and it's a moving target. And it's a moving target because it's relational, and you have to kind of like, the ever revealing truth sense, the aletheia kind of thing. And so you have the job of trying to find where the right is in the special context of whatever is happening. So yeah, that's all fascinating, and that's what it's bringing up for me. I hope that's useful.
Absolutely, and thank you, Clayton, for being here and sharing that. It's very interesting because Derrida was mentioned, and obviously, famously, Derrida has that idea that there aren't really definitions, there's difference. Like every word has an endless chain of possible meanings. And, if I define a word, what do I define a word with? Words. So then I have to define those words and those words and those words, and it goes on forever. It's an infinite change. It's always deferring. There's this idea in Derrida that there's always a deferring in language, and you never arrive at definition. So this, of course, begs the question, how then do we use words? If they are always deferring, then how is it I can talk to you and you can make sense of what I'm saying? You can instantaneously apprehend the meaning of thousands of possible meanings, you could say. Every sentence is this unstable, possibly deferring to different contexts. I mean, if you listen to people, and Jockin's made this point before, when you listen to people talk, there's jumping around, you have half phrases, you pause, you go back, like it's not straightforward at all, and yet you apprehend it. You just go bam, and it's seemingly you don't even try often. You just naturally just can do it, right? Now, I think this can be trained. I think you have to go through the training to learn to hear, long sentences, short, like you have to, there's actually different spaces of learning. And actually one of the reasons why I think philosophy is important, and hip hop and poetry, is every single one of those trains you in a different space of language. Most people say never go beyond small talk. So the only use of language they're ever trained in is simple exchange. One sentence, answer, one sentence, one center, answer, kind of back and forth, like this kind of logic of exchange. And people never have experiences of language that are used differently, if you will. But then when you read poems, you go, oh, this is a different way to use language. And then you have hip hop. This is a different way. And the reason why this is, I think, very important is because your ability to respond to different uses of language is going to be contingent onto the degree you've been exposed to it, right? And so if you enter into spaces, say, with philosophers or here or whatever, where people are using language perhaps differently, if you're not exposed to literature, exposed to poetry, or exposed to different things, you might, exit. You might just exit because you can't apprehend it, right? So I do think we can train the skill of apprehending language. But it's interesting that when you have that ability, you just understand what the person is saying without really thinking about it. You can hear them and you just apprehend it. It is completely, it's the speed of light almost. It's completely wild. And what Derrida is suggesting with this difference is, in a sense, we have a infinite calculation problem. If every word entails definitions of definitions of definitions, you should never finish processing a single sentence because it has a kind of infinite amount of information that would have to be processed. And yet we do. Huh. I always associated this with Zeno, like what Derrida's pointing to Zeno's, Zeno paradox of halfway to halfway to halfway. Basically, that's the idea. Like every word entails a Zeno paradox, if you will. And yet we have no problem going through it in the same way that we are apparently able to overcome the tortoise and Achilles problem just by walking somewhere, as, we can overcome Zeno paradoxes all the time. And yet, if you think about how we do it, it's really hard, right? That's kind of the beauty of Zeno paradoxes, is if you think about them, you go, I don't know the answer, but I know this is wrong. I know that we can do this, even though I can't explain it. Well, likewise, that we can understand words, even though it seems like there should be an infinite regress of definition to definition to definition, right? And this, I think, is a reason why, and I'll give it to Jockin here, why language seems to be a certain revelation of intelligibility in general. Not just, it's like a general revelation of how thinking works. And we ought to take it very, very seriously. You noted this fittingness. I think that's getting at it. Language seems to be this ever activity, not of defining, but a kind of calibration. You're always kind of calibrating really fast, and bam, bam, calibrating, bam, bam. There's this quick calibration that's going on, and that capacity of calibration then seems to be at the heart of the possibility of intelligibility and should be taken very, very seriously. But I'll pause, and I will give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, please.
Well, I want to add on what you just said, but I want to answer something to Daniel's point about war and naming. So I think this is actually a very useful aspect of naming, is that it picks out things that allow you to identify into the foreground what was in the background. I'm saying this because in Lesser Hippias, there's this entire discussion about the virtues and qualities of an activity in war, Odysseus versus Achilles, for example. And in fact, even actually a lot of the moral virtues, specifically on the courage side, by necessity, needed war and war activities to draw out that virtue for the Nicomachean ethics, for example. And there's actually a lot of particular nuances about it. I think actually a very important more area about it. I don't know what Daniel's particular interest about war is per se, but just to draw out some interesting details about it is some very important elements of intelligibility. Maybe people think I read one of the books over the summer was the basic, I forgot the name of the author top of my head, but it was the text of the book was about the argument that violence is actually not the inverse of intelligibility. It is actually one of those important elements of intelligibility of culture. So that's the traditional stance that war and violence are this extreme other. It's solely not culture. But the argument of that author, and I do generally agree with it, is there is great intelligibility within conflict, war, and violence. It's very much like Aristotle talks about this, where the inverse of the complete deprivation of humanity in terms of bestiality is the divine. It's this kind of excess that shows like the thing you think is the other is actually on the other side. It actually draws you into the other side of it. So I do see, but thus it's intelligible. That's what's so weird. Actually, thus is I'm bringing this up. It's like the very queerness about it all is this thing that is this limit point of you think you're on the outside of it when you're actually just returning right back into on the other side of the consideration of whatever you're talking about. I'm saying this in the sense that there's a term called it's called quickness of wit. It's a very important element of rationality for Aristotle. It's the ability to apprehend immediately the major and connecting middle term of a syllogism. So this is of his pure system of logic, Aristotle's logic, to rapidly identify the middle term of phenomenon to see the universal connection requires quickness of wit. That term gets used in military expositions. So the activity in war to grab at the immediate opportunity, the kairos kind of moment of acting to draw the solution. to do the great acts of courage, for example. And that's the whole point. That's why the discussion of Odysseus versus Achilles in Lesser Hippias becomes such an important element about what is the nature of beauty in this case when it comes to this war and the battlefield of war. Specifically, they what's called many-facedness, the many qualities of Odysseus, for example, versus the supposed simplicity of Achilles. So again, I don't know what other Daniel's area of interest about war is, but I just want to draw out just kind of what's being discussed. I say this too because another element of I say this is because you cited something I brought up before, which is the speed of understanding is not about the words, it's about trust. And actually, I mean, again, there's a colleague of ours I made Daniel introduction to because I think they're going to have a lot of interest. I hope that conversation does happen, it gets recorded and made public, because within cybernetics, this individual, again, the public paper's not public, so I don't want to give particular information. I just want to share though that this individual's paper is very fascinating because it talks about trust in cybernetic relationships and networks. And it's in fact the stability of the network is built on the necessity of trust. So it's not about these nodes of words, of names. It's the network relationship of the individuals in communication that actually allows understanding to occur. So actually that's one way to address even Derrida's critique, because it's not about the words. Yeah, these are indefinite. At best, they're just approximational landmarks. It's actually the relationship between the individuals in communication. That's why people are able to understand each other when anyone outside the relationship would absolutely have no understanding of what's happening. It'd be intelligible. It would be broken in English. And in fact, actually, Aristotle's text, one of the things I've been doing this summer is actually going back to Aristotle and reading his text in Greek. I decided just to do that to myself. And when you realize this is very broken Greek, it is not like this is just a very streamlined, smooth, edited discourse. No, this is very broken Greek. It's lecture notes. It's just like the writing you do. It's the writing I do on my notebook. It's the same thing. It's like there's no anyone outside the great babbler. Yeah, he is. When it comes to lecture notes, I mean, that's the thing. It's like you can draw a meaning from it, but it's certainly not in a certain, its syntax is not grammarly put together in a way that's intelligibly obvious to anybody looking from the outside. One could wonder about that, but I want to just draw this element of trust which is actually part of the ecosystem of relationships. I say that also because in war, why do I say that? Because in war, while generally as a group, I find we generally don't want that because we think the consequences if we go to war will be devastatingly bad. We may not survive as a species if we go down that direction. But it has to be admitted that one of the best solutions of causing a network relationship of trust within a group is war, because of the built trust dynamic of another, right? So thus you have to coordinate within the group, and it causes acceleration of trust immediately. So I just want to draw out that that's an element of intelligibility and stability of the structure unit made by an operation of war. So again, I don't know what Daniel's specific interest of war is, but just drawing out fleshing points of maybe for conversation. And last time with Clayton's point about the AI, so some of those authors I'm reading about, specifically with memory, because it draws up what memory is doing. The thing is that the AI models, what they are replicating, what they're by mimetic imitation is, and this is important, and it's in Greek too. It's basically logos algorithmus, calculation. It's not reasoning. It's not even reasoning. It's calculation. That's what's being mimicked. And what these authors are pointing out, especially by the attribution of memory, is because it has that embeddedness in memory. There's a certain, which is what all calculation tries to do. Rationality is based on calculation. What does it do? It kind of abstracts it by the power of abstraction, pulls you out from embeddedness, from enmeshment. There's certain values, there's certain valuable things about it. Not here to dismiss that. But the point out to think that is the human being is a misunderstanding. It is an element of us because we calculate. That's true, but that's what's being medically copied and produced into tools of computation. Is to compute. But I think that is the totality of human intelligence. It's misunderstanding because of things like this speed of understanding, which seems to be impossible. Which seem to point out there's something going on here. Ideas of memories attached to it, and I think a very important element is that attribution of the human being as again, it's interesting. Cybernetics was actually meant to try to, it's kind of like it's trying to reproduce life. That was just one of its original purposes, to my understanding. But what's interesting is drawn out is that it reveals that human beings, that the cybernetic entities have telos and necessity combined to. Now I'm going to tie into my note about health. What I'm getting at here is organic entities, which may not be, which are both larger than individual persons, but also of the person, because the word for instrument is the same as organ in Greek. It's very interesting, that move. But I'm bringing this up because these organic organisms have thresholds of threat, and it's actually I'm going to have with Ebert, my conversation with you and Ebert too, Daniel. Especially my notes I wrote an email afterwards. We as organic entities can respond to thresholds that actually make us better. This kind of anti-fragility property, right? As opposed to things like computers. And actually, the scene says this. Actually, the big difference of like a refrigerator and a computer compared to a human being is that when computers get hit with thresholds, they break. They were set for a certain limit of form, and if they go past that limit, they break. Human beings or other organic entities have an interesting property where there's a certain degree of not just robustness, they remain the same. There's an anti-fragility, new activity that they can reveal. In fact, that's actually what makes humans humans, is that is actually what we do. We're a kind of synchronicity of revealed new work, that the organic of the sensational soul and our vegetative activities, logos, actually, it's not like we have a new, yes, there are some new organs. Obviously, the prefrontal cortex is a new organ that did not exist before. But what it also does, it retroactively transforms all the other parts of the body. Those are in terms of, the most common example is reading. Reading is not in the individual spot in our brains. It's actually a combination of sensation, appearance of perception, then working with actually multiple parts of our brain. None of them designed originally to do that, to do the function of reading. It's a combination. It's a synchronicity of those parts all together that reveal a new activity called reading. At one example, there's many other ones you can point to, but the point is that that's my point. That's what I meant by like, look at this. There's a threshold. We've exceeded a threshold, and a new activity has revealed itself. Right? Via that's an example of what health means. So it's interesting. So even that. So I'm just kind of threading this all together. So I just want to I'll close with that and give that to the group.
Well, I think that's magnificent that the human, AI is broken by a limit where AI is broken by a limit where human beings actually encounter limits, and there's an opportunity, for Hegel to know a limit is to pass it, right? Like that limit is then incorporated into the thinking of the human being that opens up new possibilities. And autopoiesis is an idea of this self-organizing complexity. Stuart Kauffman is big on this idea that if you have a single function, the example Kauffman will always use is if you have buttons all over the floor and you have one function, which is you tie two buttons together, and you just do that over and over again, eventually you're going to get actually an entirely new phenomenon that will emerge from a single function. And it's self-organizing that gives rise to an emergence. So it's this autopoiesis has this kind of self-organizing function that eventually can saturate when it encounters a limit into new complexities that can occur. And Stuart Kauffman's amazing. But it's very interesting because as you were making the example of reading, and I'll give it to Daniel, reading emerging from this synchronicity of parts. None of these parts can read on their own, nor did they, quote unquote, plan to read. But actually, once they encounter certain limits, then they actually are able to coordinate. Well, you were mentioning trust. I think the same logic kind of applies socially, that to the degree that we can trust one another is to the degree there are possibilities of synchronicity across differences that would have never been able to generate a new autopoiesis or a new complexity without that trust. And what ends up happening as you break down trust, then you can't deal with limits. Like trust is when do you need trust? You really need it when you're hitting a limitation, because how do we go beyond the limit? Trust me, especially if you don't have the capacity to go beyond the limit, but this person is like, well, together we can. You would never do that without trust. So trust as being like the glue of the society and its capacity of creating new possibilities, wealth, complexity, etc. So they're absolutely tied together. You don't have trust, you're done. Fukuyama, I think Fukuyama's book on trust is very, very good. He emphasizes this. And if we make ourselves in the image and likeness of AI, because we think all human beings is calculation, then we will forego the type of thinking and reasoning needed in order to tarry with limitation, without which we can't have new complexities. And so the zenith of human accomplishment will be a great devolution. But the temptation of AI is that it's trustless. We don't have to worry about the negativity of trust. It's what they say with Web 3.0, foolishly. You don't have to worry about trust anymore. Well, then we don't have to worry about advancement or society or new complexities or overcoming limitation. In a sense, you don't need trust to deal with things that don't unveil a limitation because you have capacity. Trust always suggests a certain lack of capacity, right? But not impossibility of overcoming. There's a certain, I can't do it alone, but together we might. I can't do it alone, but together we might. Well, this goes back to hip hop because you can't do a hip hop cipher by yourself. You certainly can't have that same quality of surprise without the other. And there's something about trusting in the cipher. You trust that the person is going to make space to you, open up, so on and so forth. There's a lot of trust going on. And I think also what I will just comment on quickly and give it to Daniel. I think it's Clausewitz, and Owen in the Agon has made this point. He does tremendous work on scholarship of war and so on and so forth. One of the problems with the over-technoloization of war, the using of robots and tanks and so on, is it comes to seem as if there's no intelligence in war. There's just programming. But Clausewitz is quite big on the idea that strategy, being on the battlefield, actually unveils a different kind of intelligence than technical intelligence, actually, and thus violence has a certain intelligibility to it. But as you move away from war with human beings involved, cavalry and etc., and it becomes robots, or it becomes more technological, it seems as if there's no unique intelligibility in violence. Well, this seems fine until there's an understanding that violence can actually unveil the beautiful. It can reverse into the creative, right? And so if you never actually have the unique intelligibility encountered in violence, that if the violence could have at least been a wake up to return to better human intelligences, then we may be in an age where war can't even wake us up anymore. Where in the past, maybe war could have opened us up to a return in that very limited, just like you were saying, bestiality opens to the beautiful. In the extreme, the intelligibility of the horror can actually be a revelation of what you need to return to, the fully human. If war, and now I'm thinking of Dr. Simpkin and his work on drone ethics and so on and so forth, we may be reaching an age of almost a total depravity, a total damnation, where we don't even, in the act of war and violence, recover the intelligibility that could redeem us from it per se, or be the recovery. That would be like a truly terrible situation, which we might be in. And again, Clausewitz does associate, like you said, there's something about the quickness of wit that comes in war. War, the variables are moving. It's a live thinking. This is very important. It's not just an equation. You have to think, oh, this was a good plan until it started raining. Oh, this was a good plan until your general was sick. There's this live intelligence that's going on that I would also associate with diplomacy, looking at people like Kissinger's book or other thinkers. Like when you read The History of Diplomacy, you see a similar kind of intelligence of wit and thinking, how do we tarry with a different nation's first principles? How do we figure out where everyone can get something out of this? There's a wit, a quickness, a strategy. And you could say strategy is different from programming. Well, strategy is the reality of situation, of geometry over algebra. And that's a part of the revelation of violence and war, is that there's a form of intelligence that must be live, particular, and participated in, and there is a right and wrong answer. You've lost the battle if you have the wrong answer. So it's not arbitrary, right? So if you lose that sense of intelligibility and you replace it with programming, then we might be in an age where war can't wake us up to the intelligence that makes us human. And that would be a truly terrible form of conflict, even though it seems better because drones are doing all the fighting. But, everything has trade-offs. Let me give it to Daniel here. Daniel, please.
Just 2 lines that just to reflect on this war. We might be coming to a stage where war will reach a form that because of it's so technical and mechanical, it doesn't even wake us up. And then the other one was that bestiality opens the door into beauty. I think that's that's it. Yeah, it's an incredible line. Um, the Yeah, I guess I'm thinking a lot about the Platonic dialogues, I guess, and it's probably appropriate because Thomas is here and he's named a few of them. I took my first go at Parmenides about a month ago now, and then moved on to the sophist. And I guess so. I'm in a fresh sense of the extreme value of those artifacts for many reasons that we've kind of touched on or um, uh, yeah, involved. I mean, just the coming together of philosophy and art, for instance, and then the fact that those dialogues are always like a few people removed. I mean, the the only thing in Plato's voice is the title, and then the dialogue often starts with like, "This is a conversation that happened between these two, but it's being remembered by this one who's telling it to this one." So it's like this like three times removed recollection of this event, of this conversation that took place. Um, that's all just kind of contextual about the art, which I think would point most for us to the activity that we're involved in, which is this question of like these different spaces of speech that we involve ourselves in, and the um something that stuck out in the last readings was the way in which like all this preparatory work before it gets into a philosophical mode or register, which is this back and forth questioning. It's a question answer, and it's often a young person that is selected or desired to be the one who answers. So I'm thinking about Parmenides specifically, like um, uh, I'm forgetting who the particular person in the dialogue is, but Parmenides posing these questions, and then the young person is like yes or no, and the dialogue kind of moves in this manner. Um, then that dialogue points into the sophist, or at least I'm taking that kind of direction, and that's an incredibly interesting and somewhat devastating dialogue to engage with when one thinks about one's own practice of speech, and like the extent that they go to try and nail down or catch. They use the image of net. They use the image of a net. We're trying to catch the sophist, their type. Like we're trying to define them and see what they are and what they do. And it's very interesting because the one of the key things that stuck in my mind about the way that the sophist gets defined is that they say what is not is. It's the way that they relate to nothing, to the being of nothing. And then there's these contradictions that like even speaking about non-being gives it a degree of being because it's implied in speech. So you can't even speak about it in a sincere way, or at least you have to be very careful. Or this might be the place where the sophist hides, is that they hide in this use of nothing, in like a certain usefulness, and it might like stun the interlocutor or wow them. But I think, okay, that's the Platonic uh, stream or riff or thought. But to respond to the war side of things, which I think it's in the Timaeus. I know my voice is coming through. Not coming. Okay, shoot. This thing's temperamental. Um, the it's somewhere it might be in the Timaeus where this account of imitation gets drawn out or really elaborated, um, and then they're speaking about war, and Socrates is asking whoever it is if the poet, like the one who writes about the epic of war, who writes the epic of like this battle that happened. Socrates is asking the interlocutor, like, does this person know? Do they have knowledge of war, or like what is their relation to it? They depict it incredibly well. It's this masterpiece. It's this epic of the manner of war. But the claim or the ion, dope. Yes, that sounds good. Yeah, that uh, I recollect that. I think the the so that. That difference there. So I think what Socrates really leans on in making that distinction is form and imitation, or the difference between the two. There's a form of war, and because the poet is playing at the appearance of war and imitating that, they don't possess the form of it. Now that idea is exactly what gets played on in the Sophist in terms of thinking the form. And it's where Socrates is considered not yet philosophical in the Parmenides. Parmenides says to Socrates, he's like, I see that the spirit of philosophy is, it's not the exact words, but near to you, but it hasn't quite yet taken hold of you, because you consider some things above your consideration or below your consideration. And the question that is raised is like, do sticks or mud or shit, does that have form? Do those have forms? And Socrates in his youth is like expressing that he's avoided that question out of this fascination or love for the form. He's wanted to remain around like the form of the good, the just, the beautiful, etc., and even like the form of the human, or something like that. But it's a precisely at that point which Dimitri asked me to look out for anywhere where Parmenides spoke about shit. Because, you know, like in the Cyzicean stream, the excremental remainder, and this, like the spirit of philosophy, where does that take hold? And in that dialogue, it's precisely at that point where Socrates no longer considers something below his consideration. The last thoughts on war in terms of why I was seeding it. I didn't have a particular direction, and I know it's an incredibly, it's a big thing to just see, because it could go in many directions. I'm thinking of it, but tends to be productive. Part of the reason is because I just it was part of the thought today, part of thinking it. Beelzebub's tales to his grandson. There's a particular chapter. What's the periodic destruction of the existence of other beings is the way that Gurdjieff phrases war. And the interesting thoughts there around like sacrifice, or a model that gets employed there is like we have being duties to the cosmos, and maybe it's appropriate that the Timaeus is in the sphere of this conversation. Like we have duties to servicing, say, like heavenly bodies, like the moon. And when we don't fulfill those services, which comes at these crucial moments like death or maybe intense grief, then nature has to recalibrate. It has to accommodate that lack of our fulfilling a certain function. And maybe this links to our idea of like, what is it that we are in, or what are we participating in, what is space. But when we don't fulfill that function, it creates like a lack or a void in nature that nature has to compensate for, and then it adjusts. But this now I'm like getting more just constellation kind of speaking. I mean, the element that I want to add to what you were saying about war, Daniel, in terms of the beauty that this, I think it's the terrible love of war. I think this is also something to consider, like the way in which it's a specter that we have a love for, or maybe for reasons that Thomas was pointing at, that it binds us immediately. It is also an instance that can draw virtue out of us. Maybe they're unique virtues to that instance, but that was a lot, and I'll close it with hoping that I'm saying something in a philosophical spirit rather than like enjoying my own speech.
You absolutely were. And, I should note, another way to perhaps point at this problem just on your last mark there, Burke has this idea of sublime versus beauty. Now, what he means by sublime is different from, say, Kant, but it's the notion, basically, sublime in Edmund Burke is Thanos. It's the death. It's very much tied to this kind of self-destruction sort of idea. And the idea is that if human beings require experiences of the sublime, or the social order breaks down, and the society, though, has to contain experiences of the sublime, say in art, or else people, to scratch the itch of the Thanos, I'll say Thanos, scratch the itch of the Thanos will tear the society down. But at the same time, too, there's the danger of people confusing the beautiful with the Thanos, right? So you can't have that. So you have to have experiences of the beautiful, or else people are going to unleash the sublime for an experience of the beautiful, and everything's going to go to crap, right? Now, again, what Burke means by sublime is different from other thinkers. But so there's an idea that there's a self-correction now, because if you give in to the Thanos and the social order breaks down, it will naturally create conditions of reminders of the beautiful, because you'll see valor, you'll see virtue on the battlefield, you'll see, people overcoming tragedy. So it will point toward the beautiful that can create a kind of recovery mechanism out of Thanos eventually. And then you'll get back to but here's the problem. When you get back to the beautiful, and one generation builds up the society toward the beautiful, they're trying to create a society that the children forget, because ideas are not experiences. And then they go back, and then it just kind of repeats. But at least in war, or when everything breaks down, it naturally creates the conditions of a reminder of the beautiful and the need to contain Thanos. Well, it could be argued now that war is not going to do that because of drones and things like that. So you don't necessarily have this autocorrection structure going on, which all the more reason to separate the good and the beautiful and to save the beautiful, because we can't rely on the failures of the good to create mechanisms of reminding us of the beautiful again. The stakes are quite high in that regard. Now, that argument has to be expanded on, but I think about that a lot. I think also this idea of thinking the mud, the stick, the thesis, this different things, like if you can't think the form of that, then what is form? Is it even what you think it is? Because if there's limitations to it, then is it in fact this principle by which things unfold toward the beautiful if it's cut off from the mud, right? So it's very interesting to think that you have to think everything to have the true spirit of philosophy. I think that's getting at something very profound. Also, when you were talking about and then I'll give it to Jockin here, the use of nothing and not referring to nothing, this does point to the problem of art again, because you're asking, if the poet writes about war, but they've never experienced war, do they actually know what they're talking about? One of the great problems we have is I just talk about it all the time in the conflict of mind as ideas are not experiences. The problem that the idea of war and the seeing movies about war is not the same as the experience of war. It is just truly hard, like the way people talk, it's just truly hard to understand how bad war is if you've not been in it. Like sometimes I worry that the criticisms now increasingly of the World War II consensus are not taking seriously the dangers of global war and how severe it is. Now, there's lots of critiques to be made of the World War II consensus. I'm not saying, and in fact, I think it's ultimately going to have to come back to the English and American civil wars. That's what you actually have to think at the end of the day. But we struggled to take seriously war. And here's my point. It goes to the AB thing. I think we basically tried to make people not fall into war and violence by using art, movies, to show people how bad it is. Like, this is so bad, you don't want to do it again. The issue is because being told and seeing something is bad will never be as extreme as experiencing it. So this way of using art, maybe, or movies, to avoid bad things is not going to be enough. For me, and this is one of the reasons I got into the AB, is because you have to expose the logical form that leads to the conditions of war. Like when you read about World War I, nobody meant to get into World War I. It was the logic of problem solving that led to multipolar traps, right? You have to unveil the logical form that is leading people time and time again down this Kafka hallway to somewhere they don't want to freaking go. You can't stop bad things by showing they're bad, because the seeing of the bad is never enough as the experience. Now, the experience can make you change without the revelation of the logical form, because the emotional impact is so high, but that is temporary until you get the generation that doesn't have the experiences. And the effort of the historian to pass the experience is impossible. Historians can't pass down experiences. They can only pass down representations. And that is never enough to actually get people to get, because the mistakes of history were made for good reason. This is critical. It wasn't a lack of rationality that led to them. It was a presence of rationality. So you can't think your way out of the mistakes of history. Thinking is what got you there. But then are we screwed? Well, under the logical form of, AA, autonomous rationality, yeah. But of course, you are. You're going to just end up in ever game theory. So you have to change the logical form itself by which people are operating. And so for me, that means that's why art being tragedy, irony, and what I think great art is so important, because great art unveils the logical form as the problem. If you do what's right, as Odysseus, you end up in a Greek tragedy. It is competing goods. Like, good art shows that rationality leads you to rational impasses or Nash equilibria. So they point out not merely that war is bad, but that the logical form by which people operate lead them into various impasses. That's what great art does. It's a revelation of how thought structures us as being toward these situations. And if art is simply trying to unveil to people, this is bad or this is good, ideas are not experiences. It's not the same, now I'm not saying art cannot point people toward experiences of the beautiful or attest to various possibilities, but unless you have a revelation of the logical form, it will not be enough. And then the giant claim is that a key way to habituating people into new logical forms is uses of language. The way they use language, because telling people to be AB versus AA, telling people to not be, that's not going to change anyone, because you have habits of autonomous rationality. You have to change people's habits. Well, how do you do that? You have to create spaces in which they develop new habits, like online what we're doing, or hip hop, or the Cypher. Those are spaces of developing new habits of language and thinking that habituate people into new logical forms that can help you avoid these rational impasses that continue to arise time and time again. So that, to me, if you take all of that very seriously, then what you are doing in art will change. Art is not about showing people war is bad, although it can show that. It has to primarily unveil the logical form that leads to those bad things that no one means to end up getting into. And to the degree it can show that, which means it's going to show the problem of internally consistent systems, the problem of irony, and all these things we're obsessed of in the truth of the rational. If it unveils that, now it is actually going to be more sublative than reinforcing. And the reason actually it can be reinforcing is because you're like, well, I know that war is terrible. I'll never make those decisions because I've seen All Quiet on the Western Front. I remember Bands of Brother. I know war is bad. Therefore, I'm equipped to, in a position of influence and power, not end up into it. Well, now art now is increasing the likelihood you end up into it because you're overconfident, because you actually think you wouldn't, because you know better. I'm not going to make the mistakes those people in the past made. No, you're still operating by the same logical form. You're collapsing the good into the beautiful, so you will. So this is where art can actually be ironic in that it can contribute to repeating the mistakes by simply showing people the bad, as opposed to unveiling the logical form that has to be wrestled down. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin here. Mr. Jockin, please.
That's interesting, the art one, because, I just I had an intuition and when I double check it. It is interesting when you look at, for example, the Futurists, it's almost a caricature. They were straight up like, they really were enthusiastic for the war. They were. It's interesting to show that before World War One. And then you switch to Dada, which is after, which is this kind of complete defeat of, well, that's it. The entire project of modernity is useless. Let's just be nonsense now. Basically, it's almost Deleuzian and Bumblebees before Bumblebees, the flights of thought of Bumblebees. It's quite interesting. So, I do think that's interesting to look at the structure of how art is basically, at the very minimum, art is truly, it's very interesting. It's a symptom or sign of the kind of cultural movement at that time. And in war, it's very interesting to show this complete inversion occurred. Afterwards, it's really interesting. I think it's very important, actually good point is that, so you made this comment about, I don't have a strong argument to make yet about this question of because obviously it's one of the major projects I'm very interested in is the discussion of the beautiful with violence. I think that's a huge part. I think if you get this wrong, you can't get this solved, or you can't get this really addressed very well. But I say this because, again, my card on my table when I taught my course on beauty and Plato is, if you put violence as something that can come from, like beauty can be something that comes from violence, if you make that claim, you're in trouble, because now you cannot disambiguate it from goodness. You can't, because it's in vectors of good that this absolutely plays out. It's commonly, basically, it's conflations of different goods. it's going to be a competition of resources, or some competitional is going to show up, and violence will be the restitution, the conclusion of that impasse. I say that also because actually I could point out some more research I've done recently since those courses. Really interesting in Meno, this interesting moment where they're trying to define virtue. And then at one point, Plato has Meno answer the question, well, wait a minute, look me through this. Are there many beauties for one goodness? It's a very interesting move. He asked that question of Meno. Is there many? It is the kalos. He says it gets translated as many fine things, but if you go into the Greek, it is beauty, many beauties. Are there many beauties for the sake of one goodness? And it actually, through that operation, it shows the impossible. Basically, people do, like, it shows it in contradiction. That's what Plato has presented, if that's the case. I just find it interesting because they kind of built the argument about the operation of goodness and beauty. Basically, that if there are many beauties with one goodness, then this collapses and it causes an error, basically, in thought. I'm just saying this. I do. So what I'm getting at here is with this Dada and futurism move, it is interesting. I say this because the war occurred, World War I occurred, a crisis of revelation occurred. And then what was the response? There were many vectors of art after World War I. I'd be first to tell you that. But I go to Dada because I said it's just very interesting because it's a complete, what they wanted to do. People don't realize this because we've defanged what Dadaism was trying to do. It tried to destroy language. That's what its purpose was. Its purpose was to say this thing you call language, the logos, is so important to you, it's useless. It's basically a bunch of dust. And we're going to do this by showing you the materiality of the language. Now, it's very ironic. The reason why I know about this, because in graphic design teaching and history, we constantly go to it because they emphasize the visual. We talk about it in terms of the visualization of language, right? The kind of making the emphasis, the materiality of language is kind of visual emphasis. But I think a lot of us in the graphic design history point of view, we do a disservice to not understand what was trying to be done at that time. What it was trying to do was, that was a very deconstructionist move to try to dismiss the meaning, the significational value of language in Dada's move. Because it said it was this kind of utter defeat in the face of logos, rationality, and reasoning, in the face of World War I. Because remember, everybody was very enthusiastic. Everyone thought it was going to be, as we've said many times, it's going to be a short blip, a little cough, maybe at most a little blippy of a Ukraine war, something like that. Contained little blip that we can just, it is very interesting to point that out, right? That I also say that because, basically what we do every time we see these kind of these pockets of violence that show up today, there is always this kind of panic that it's going to cause the World War I explosion. Infection, basically contagion infection, where it's just going to explode and cause World War III. We're all kind of living in this ghost. I'm just thinking through the thought process of that. What I'm getting at here is, it is interesting, especially with Dadaism, especially when it's been defanged, because it's one of the things graphic designers we point to talk about our practice and our craft, kind of the visualization of language. So it's been defanged. So one can make an argument that's us rehabilitating and restoring what Dadaism in its nihilistic stance, the beauty inside their thought. And you could take it that way, but I just find it interesting that was definitely not their intention at the time. And I'm just sitting through in this what is the response to war, right? Because there's a very big difference of the idealism of war, which is what I think futurism is basically kind of pointing to, versus the people who experience it and what's their consequence, and this kind of pure what's the word? This kind of subjugation, like this kind of abogational state of emptying out the subject, right? Basically of hope. Basically, this hope with this destitution. There you go. This destitutional state of Dadaism in particular. And yet, ironically, even though in the complete destitution, people then also saw beauty in that. Again, I don't know what to say with this, but it's just an interesting observation. And by the way, I think the note, I don't know if it was you, Daniel, or someone else who said it about this idea that, I think it was you, Daniel, about trust, where it's the lack of capacity, right? It's actually, we do operations of trust because we sense there's something lacking that we need, that we cannot do ourselves. I think that's just an interesting vector to think about. Also related experience is actually from Islamic tradition. There's this whole point of something called the tasting of death. Basically, like every soul will taste death. I think that's quite important because that emphasis of tasting, not know death, taste it. That means that idea of experience. It's a very different category than idea of it. I think that's a very important point, which then leads to ion being cited. I'm trying to pull everything together and doing the best I can. But I think I could do it. So with ion is really interesting because, yes, this whole point is that the problem is in terms of body of knowledge of chariot racing or warfare or the ship, the poet, and this is very important who we're talking to. It's not necessarily, it's not even a poet. It's a rhapsode. This is a very important distinction. So the rhapsode is not even the poetic, it's not a poet in terms of he's the author of writing the poem. He is the reenactment of Homer, for example. So really in this kind of example, Homer is the poet, the rhapsode is just he is a repetitional reenactment. He's an actor of Homer's work. But yet he's still, and this is very interesting, that in there, Plato says, your operation of knowledge is something very different. It is divine inspiration. That's what you have, which applies to the basically Plato mentions this later in Phaedrus with divine mania, the fourth mode particularly, a kind of divine interaction. And there's also enthusiasm from Aristotle. So Aristotle, again, it's not like everyone thinks he's a syllogistic rationality person, but he had his domain of topics were way broader. And I think it's very important, the idea, and actually example of the magnets, so the idea that these magnetic chains, so the operation of reality, I don't want to call it knowledge, but at least or maybe you can, which is very different. The enactment of reality that the rhapsode and the poet does is a different kind than the operation of ideas. Like that's the point. I kind of getting at. So what Daniel's doing with this point of experience to ideas are this artificial mimetic otherness, just kind of like pointing to. They do not have the livingness of ideas. I also say that because in Meno, this whole point of why is the Platonic rhetorician very important? That's not the same kind of rhetorician as you typically presented in Phaedrus, for example, or even in Meno. Basically, Meno is a student of a rhetorician sophist. It's because this has to be the living word. It has to be this particular subject with this particular interaction, not this written speech that has to be reenacted later. So it's really interesting, the kind of positionality Plato presents for us when he has this kind of rhapsode supposedly having divine interaction with experience, yet also pointing out that the reenactment of writing by a sophist, of a rhetorician or sophist, is not the same. It's not the same kind of work. I think a very big part of it is and actually he says this, is that he gives you have imitations of knowledge, not the reality of it, because you just say the words. So it's what I'm going to try to say here as an argument on the fly is to say, what is that distinction? Why is he not so judgmental of the rhapsode in Ion, yet very judgmental of this kind of written language, right? We're seeing in Phaedrus. I think it's because the connection of experience, that basically by the divine interaction of experience, which is the bypassing of ideas in the first place. It basically bypasses it from the get-go, but gives you real reality. And these are operations. And actually, a point Aristotle says it's true. The divine enthusiasm does what basically both prudence and wisdom do over time, instantaneously, and better. So basically says it's actually better than all these human operations of rationality and logos. Does it better. And that's because, by the way, logos actually has an operation called basically nous, which is interaction with archive, principle. Principle is actually the origin point of all this. Logos is just our means to in the first place. I'm trying to build out the argumentation here about why this is the case. How can we explain that the account by ideas is not the same as the experience? The reason why is because experience is connection to archive, the principle. That's why. And then, by the way, Lowe's note. And then, by the way, that's the thing I always say. I think a lot of people who read Plato think this is again two-world idea of Plato. There's some texts that give you that argument. I could say that, and it's very true. But there's a lot of other dialogues I could point out that's absolutely not the case. Because, and at one point is what Daniel, you said about as a younger philosophy student, he's presented in Parmenides as still in the beginning of his training, because he wasn't accounting for material reality. And that's the key. That in Phaedrus, we see a much more mature approach, because he points out in that fourth divine mania that, and let alone actually, quite frankly, the greater Hippias, where beauty is directly addressed to, the body and material reality is addressed for. It is not dismissed. It is in the beautiful, because it is in the recollection of this witnessing of beauty of this particular person and this particular body and this particular event, that you get a recollection of the beautiful as a form universally. And by the way, actually, it's very interesting to know that Parmenides' line of attack on Socrates at the time as a young in Parmenides is on the form of the beautiful. It is not the form of justice, not wisdom. It's beauty. That's the one he points them to. So I don't find this. I'm of the opinion that Platonic dialogues are continuous. They're not changing of minds or contradictions of thought. I do think they're systematic, and I do think they have a connection of thought. And I find it's more useful and interesting when we think of it that way. It takes some work, because we see these apparent tensions, but I think it's quite interesting. Okay, I've talked enough. That's all I got.
No, that was fantastic. That point on thinking of the dialogues as continuous, I so agree. I think there's horrific tendency of separating things into different books. We have to look, you have the metaphysics of Aristotle and the politics. No, it's a continual line of developing thought. You have to assume these thinkers are a continuation, or you really miss the fullness of it. It's a major problem. I mean, I would say the same of literature. I mean, when you start removing novels and philosophy from a continual conversation where people are replying to other texts, it's far less interesting. But when it's a continuation, and you think of the canon, and this is true, the canon, and Camellia, he makes this point, and Harold Bloom made this point. The canon is not a product of a bunch of experts saying these are the best books. The canon emerged on what artists were being inspired by what artists, who had the most inspiration and citation. It was an emergent phenomenon, and so it is a trace of a continual unfolding of thought. Obviously, you have to do work, like you said, but it is not this separated, unrelated collection of some vague sense of the best books. It's simply what the artists in the creative act found themselves at hand grabbing, and they weren't doing it just rationally. They were in the thing. It was the livingness that had them grab Shakespeare or Dante. They would have grabbed someone else if they could, but this was what is hand. It's just very important. If anyone, and Christian, good to see you, sir. There may be a storm coming, so I might be running out of time. We will see. You never know in the state of Virginia, do you? But before the house is shut down again by lightning and losing power and stuff, the phrase, the livingness of ideas. I really like that phrase as you were speaking, because livingness seems to be a key quality in all of this. That seems to be the awakening, the spirit of philosophy. And there's a difference between the living ideas, the experience of ideas, and the using ideas to simply correspond, this livingness principle. Because I'm also thinking about this idea that you have in this kind of notion of a self-correction, of the violence of war awakens people up to the beautiful, because the risk of that is saying, oh, so violence is beautiful. Well, it's the idea that when everything falls apart, it's almost like you remember, before the war. It's a stimulation of the otherness. It's not in the conflict itself, but it actually can move people toward recollection. And then in honor of that recollection, they rise themselves to the occasion. There's a sense of what was lost. War creates an impact, a feeling of lack that then people can respond to. But it's not the violence itself that is beautiful, but a reminder of the lack of beauty that is brought out. But lack is not nothing, so this can kind of compel and change action, right? It's very interesting, though, because the problem with drone warfare or war or violence that you're seeing today is it doesn't have the livingness in it. It's robot, so it can't have, where there's a lack of this livingness, the possibility of this restore, this remembering, this coming back, seems to be very, very difficult. And you see, every time you have a philosophical conversation or a conversation of flow or hip hop or Cypher, there's a certain recalling of livingness. Oh, it is possible to have an experience of livingness. Oh, it is possible to actually find livingness in life, not just to be going through the robotic motions of it. And the more you do that, the more you create habits of doing that, and the more easy it is to have that memory at hand when you need it, to reorganize your activity when you're in a place of perhaps forgetting it. And it is interesting too, because like you're saying, trust be a lack of capacity. It's a lack of capacity that has a belief in the possibility of the capacity. Therefore, I'm going to look to the other person. So when you trust, you're saying, I lack the capacity, but I believe the thing we're trying to do is possible. But I need the other, right? It's not a lack of capacity where you say, well, the capacity is lacking because it doesn't exist. No, it is one that is found in the relation. And so likewise, there's something about lack, as we've talked about many times, where you have these experiences of lack that push you into relation, that push you into action beyond the thing. And the notion is the notion that in war, there's a reminder of a need to reestablish relation with the other so we don't kill each other, so that we regain the capacity of the beautiful, or else we lose it. But here's the interesting idea. I'm not, this whole function of Thanos to recall the beautiful may require people to share a background in which they can recall the beautiful, or they believe in metaphysics, or they believe in God. Like there's no atheist in a foxhole, they say, right? Well, what do you do if you have a society that doesn't believe in metaphysics or doesn't believe in the beautiful? Would war remind them of it? Maybe not. And in fact, it doesn't seem like it necessarily does, right? So this self-correct, maybe there was an idea in history where war had a self-correcting mechanism where you weren't in an age that had saturated the use of the good to where we are now, where we require the beautiful or we're in trouble. Maybe, but now you're almost in a period. What's kind of interesting, I just think about this a lot because there are other examples. If there were in history self-correcting mechanisms to remind people of the beautiful, those might be over. They may have been used now, and you can't. The self-correction is not there. But that's actually a certain revelation, because then it unveils in that lack that the good was never just the beautiful, actually. Because if war can lose the principle of the reminding of the beautiful, then you can't say that violence itself is the beautiful. It simply instead had a structure of recalling the lack, right? Well, that could make it seem like the violence was beautiful, but actually it was in a historical situation where it could be a reminder of the beautiful and point people toward the beautiful. But if you are in a situation now where it no longer has that potential because we're overly drunk on technological rationality, or we're overly habituated to non-metaphysical thinking, then that self-correction will not be there, which is actually evidence of the distinction between the beautiful and the good in the very fact that now you have a lack of self-correcting mechanisms that are in operation. So that in of itself could be a certain testament to the distinction. I'll give it to Daniel here. And that then would be where, because I do think there are these kind of almost graces in history where you have periods of maybe thousands of years where you can make intellectual mistakes and not face the consequences because there's a kind of grace. But then as things go along, if you continue to make that mistake, you got to grow up. It's like Paul saying, you could have milk when you're young, but now you got to have solid food. It's like, okay, this is 2025. We can't be making the mistake of conflating the good and the beautiful. You could get away with that for a while, but now we're at a particular period where you have to separate it. Well, that's why there's oddly a kind of progress to history, but it's not this crude, simplistic progress. It's a progress that is history is like, hey, you got to figure out the distinction between the good and the beautiful and progress in that sense, or you die. Oh, so it's a progress of facing a ultimatum. It's not a progress of us getting more freaking rational and avoiding ultimatums. It's coming upon ultimatums. And like it's that Hegelian idea that the future is better than the past, but there's no guarantee that there's a future, because the conditions of realizing the better future may overwhelm and we destroy ourselves. And so I sometimes, and then I'll give it to Dan, there does seem to be in history perhaps these kind of graces where once they are exhausted, though, you've got to get things straight, or else that's it. And that's kind of the balance between justice, grace, progress, and avoiding a naive progress, etc. So, but let me give it to Daniel, and if anyone has any final thoughts. Daniel, please.
Yes, da-da, 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 daughter, skibbity-doop-up, skibbity-dap. Yeah, Dadaism. I was just thinking about the application of that to like speech and sound. Because like when I'm trying to just fall into a bit of a flow and my sense making can't keep up with the rhythm, then I start just making these sounds a little bit maybe even tongues like at that edge, it's like da 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 da, and the repeating. But that's a useless useless addition. Thomas, what the distinctions that you brought in there with the Platonic dialogues and imitation, the manner of imitation in the poet, and the kinds of knowledge that the physically enacting rhapsody, I think was the word, as opposed to the one who constructs the poem, and then the relation of their knowledge or their relatedness to the knowledge of the thing being imitated. It's definitely very valuable. I mean, that's a big takeaway for me, thinking into those areas, and then also linking what is very impressive in terms of your knowledge of the Platonic corpus and across the dialogues. And I mean, I'm influenced by a similar reading that doesn't make that distinction between early, middle, and late, or it recognizes certain continuity in it. But making that case, I think, is pretty interesting, and I would be interested to know like what your ground zero is, like what your Platonism would be, if it's not this what it often gets kind of shorthanded to in terms of the ideal realm of forms or something, and that implies this kind of two worlds or etc. Aristotle GPT. Yeah, Thomas Jockin. Yeah, dope.
Well, yeah, I mean, and by the way, I mean, actually, the longer I've been doing the research, I would say actually Aristotle too. It's funny. My background was Aristotelian first, then I went from Aristotle to forward to Thomas Aquinas and then Al-Ghazali. So I went in that direction, and then actually by the encouragement of Johannes from Halcyon Guild, I went to Plato. I spent 3 years with him, basically, and 2-3 years with him. And now that I'm back reading Aristotle again, the beautiful kalos, the kolon kalos, is everywhere. It's constantly everywhere in in the dialogues and in Aristotle's writings. It's over and over again, constantly drawn out. I mean, so if I had to put a kind of, which is interesting for me, because I'm a designer, so I come from the visual art tradition. So, and it's just that's to kind of give you a reference point where I'm coming from. To find out that beauty, the thing that my whole purpose of study and work was towards this, was actually in the Greeks from the very beginning. And in fact, contrary to what I was presented while I was an undergrad and all my time in school, that as opposed to any other category transcendental, it's the beautiful, was actually the orientation point for these thinkers, that it basically transformed my entire understanding of my practice. So on a personal level, let alone what are the consequences if we thought through these thinkers, Plato and Aristotle, with that understanding, and that all their works were pointing out the complications and the nuances about that perspective. So for example, and then you realize things like love, the relationship of love to knowledge. You realize these are not dichotomous relationships, they're actually unified. The whole purpose of knowledge is that it's by love via a drive towards the beautiful. And this drive of the beautiful is not this kind of big God daddy other on the outside, giving us a law of judgment. It's actually, it fits into a theological account too, which then leads, that's a whole separate discussion. I have no problems dumping it in here. As opposed to a judgmental competitive God that is there, his desires and wishes supersede and are meant to crush ours. Instead, the beautiful revealed in this way shows that these are a non-competitive, ever revealed possibility of greater actuality revealed through the engagement of the beautiful. And that the purpose of our acquisition of knowledge is to get access to a state of being. So knowledge is not just an isolated, individuated head on a stick of being correct. So actually that's a big obsession of the authos, the correct, the right. But instead it is becoming a dispositional state of being that gets you access to more reality. And I say that because things like technes were not just completely thrown away craft, they were actual knowledge. And in fact, you cannot get, and that's the thing, here's a good point from Aristotle, you cannot get off the ground to get to the intellectual virtues, let alone theological, if you don't have moral virtue, meaning bodily virtues in the first place. So the body thus becomes not this annoyance in the way or this thing to be indifferent about, but is a key instrument that is for the purpose of actualization of the beautiful. Thus, and even in Plato, the one you most think is the Gnostic stance of dismissal of the body. And there are some dialogues that show that, like Phaedo famously has that line of the tomb of the soul is in the body. That, like, I don't deny that it exists, but it's certainly not the full story of what Plato's thought is. And that's, as I said earlier, about the necessity of the body of the material reality being revealed in the beautiful at the same time. Because also you realize in this way of understanding the beautiful, all these kind of contradictions or challenges, the one and the many, basic ideas versus experience, love versus knowledge, all these things that are supposedly the dichotomous relationships are actually all unified. They actually have a opportunity for a possibility of understanding that is, well, basically allows for a kind of revealed new possibility of orientation. Now, is there still tensions or unresolved issues about it? Yes, and that's actually why I say theology gets involved, because those things cannot, my personal opinion, can get resolved in non-theological accounts. But you can get a lot further, you can get pretty far along in the question of the beautiful. Actually I had a conversation actually with Jacob, by the way. I know, because like with the Cypher and all that, and I know he's at Philosophy Portal right now. So I had a conversation with him last year about this point. How can a Muslim and a Christian talk with each other? How can we have discourse with one another when we have theological differences that are ontological? How can we do it? The beautiful, that's the best shot we got. And it is the possibility. So thus, from a certain level grounding of this investigation of Plato and Aristotle, and I realized if you see the importance of the beautiful for both these thinkers, you realize that an entire new domain of investigation of philosophy is possible. And this is really important, both from a geopolitical point of view in our current time and place, as well as also just theological relationships. That's anyway. So if you want to ask Daniel any other points, that's fine. But here you go. That's what I can share with you.
So the beauty goes da da, and then this yeah.
Well, it's not. I mean, by the way, the tada is a very particular kind of tada. It's a kind of revelational revelation. So thus it's actually, so at the stumping ground, I mean, this comment a bunch of other individuals. The whole point I'm going to say is in the net session, on the OG Row conversation that is going to come out tomorrow about truth. If you think truth is just correspondence, that's no different. That's just mimetic imitation. That's all it is. That's just saying that the abstractional symbols in your of language correspond with the external reality of facts. That's no different than saying beauty is just when the painting depicts a close likeness to the thing it's depicting. It's the same operation of the mimesis. So that's so as an example. So thus, when we see this understanding of beauty is not that, you realize that all the other transcendentals get transformed. And you actually get a better, I mean, for me, a much more immediate understanding of what Heidegger's talking about, for example, when he's talking about truth is not correspondence. That's what he's saying. When he's saying that, he's pointing that out because he says aletheia, which is revealing. And in fact, and then actually, I think a lot of people get confused on this because they think like, oh, that's the hidden in the manifest, right? It's basically every time everything's accounted for, there's a hiding, and it's not. And this leads to basically one project I pointed out that with the gardeners I talked through with this is the lacks that reveal itself are not nothing, which is generally the problem of logocentrism, which is to say that if my intelligibility of my account is so perfect mimetically sealed, anything that's missing from this account is nothing. It's not worth in consideration. We just dismiss it. We don't count it. It's nothing. When in reality, that's not even real. So actually you're adding falseness in your account. It's actually falsity in the account because it is there. You're just choosing not to talk about it. So it also becomes Daniel's project, the absolute choice of that. Is this nothing or is this lack? And when you choose this lack, it means it actually shows us the possibility of revealing that something can be in one state and be in another state because it's in lack. Which was always there. Aristotle has this concept. That's also another thing too. In Aristotle, another aspect of my research besides beauty was lack. It was Srisi. So Srisi has many said in many ways, and it was converted over time to mean privational deprivation. So like amputation of an arm. That's a lack. You lack the arm, for example. And then it usually gets critiqued then to say any kind of discussion about that's just a normative subjectivity of the mind, right? Versus that's not the total story. What lack is, it's all possible. It's called basically the kind of absent presence that allows for things to come to be in the first place. So those things like the hora and from Timaeus is actually a point, in my opinion, I really do believe that the hora discussed in Plato's Timaeus is 3C. I really think it is, because it has the same function in terms of what it's trying to do. It's the receptacle for which the absent presence of revealing happens to be. Also, I say this because in our training, the big concept we talk about is figure ground, about negative space and positive space. Great art is very aware, visual art is very, very aware of the negative space. With students, I can constantly tell when students are not aware of their negative space when they're designing their composition versus the ones that are aware of the negative space. So thus this absent space becomes intelligible. And it's actually the awareness about that that allows a revealing of new actuality, new accountability, new clarity, and openness of kind of aletheia revealingness. So this is all to point out that we get a deeper understanding of contemporary thinkers when we go back to Plato and Aristotle, when we think about their understanding of beauty. And that actually resolves a lot of the tensions historically we have in our accounts of Platonism and Aristotelianism. And also, by the way, other concepts that get very interesting, like health. Health becomes a very incredible topic because when you see it when you just want to start seeing it this way, which Aristotle talks about, very applicable to our understanding of basically what is an organism, what is a person, what is a substance. So anyways, there you go. That's the thesis. That's the provocation I can give you.
No, absolutely fantastic. And my apologies, the storm is getting bad, so I'll have to jump here. Of course it is. So I'll have to jump and check on things and make sure the porch does. But as a few closing remarks, and it's wonderful to see everyone today. Beauty is that experience that changes the possibility of intelligibility of everything else. If you have another way to look at this is if you have a single experience of AB in your life that is genuinely AB, then AB is possible in all experiences. And so that one experience changes kind of everything, right? Another way to put this kind of almost theologically is if in the history of the world, you could say, let's say if in the history of the world, there has been one genuine experience of the divine, just one, then the divine exists. So likewise, if you can have a single experience of the beautiful, then that has a rewriting of the possibilities that are latent in all things that are the case. And it moves it from correspondence to this unveiling that I think is very, very important. I certainly think that basically the only chance of deep diversity, engaging in conversation, theologically, politically, socially, etc., will be based on the beautiful. Because you have to believe in an unveiling structure that no one has a monopoly on if you're going to do the difficult work of dealing with diversity. So basically, until now, we haven't had to have the prime principle of interaction be the beautiful because global pluralism hasn't had the technology and the global connectivity to bring the average person in contact regularly with deep diversity. Of course, you had the Silk Roads, of course, you had interaction, but now the average person is encountering it. So the principle has to move more from the logos to the beautiful. And that's extremely important. I think that the other thing I will say that Jockin pointed out that's so important, and then I will run before the storm takes us, is that there's this notion that it's all about a state of being. Like the truth is about a certain state, a certain mode of being. Well, it's like training to be able to do the hip hop cipher. It's like training to do arts to be able to sit down and think of a story. What is all of this? It's about a certain mode of being, right? Like the experience of the beautiful unveils the possibility of, it suggests the possibility of there being conditions that unveil the beautiful. So what kind of mode of being do you have to increase the probability of that or to participate in that? And the way you use language can, I think, go a long way to open you up to different modes of being, different states of being that can afford different kinds of experiences. And I think very often it is not by chance that many people that say devote themselves to an art form or devote themselves to a non-rational project have had a mystical experience or an experience of the divine or something they can't put into words that then compels years and years of behavior afterwards. Very interesting. Almost as if that has suggested to them there is a certain kind of experience that is possible, and now I believe it is a good rational use of time to try to develop the mode of being to increase the probability of that experience more than less, and to even be able to bring it in community with other people. And I know the internet's getting bad because of the lightning. There is a funny way in which human beings, interestingly, do exist naturally as if the body is a tomb. We do exist naturally prone to think in two worlds in Gnosticism. We're prone to that. It almost seems very natural. We're not prone. You know, there's always been that idea that two-worldism has been this irrational thing that humans, we were convinced by religion and we were brainwashed and so on and so forth. Well, it looks like the first activities that human did was build temples and be religious. Like the tendency to two-worldness has always been with us. And to treat the body as a tomb has always been with us. Part of the intellectual journey is, in fact, to take the two-ness into a oneness, is to bring the form, to bring the beautiful together, to actually unveil that materiality itself is a metamateriality. That materiality is not a stable thing, that it is not a correspondence. The two-worldness, in a sense, is a grace in that it's an error, but it's an error that at least has the possibility of making materiality not what it seems. And although you could take that in a wrong direction, it could open the possibility of the not what it seems turning in what seems being an unfolding, right? Where although the two-worldness is a mistake, it creates enough questioning about what is to actually transform your relation that you may never get to the beautiful if you don't have the two-world or feeling like the body is a tomb. If you never felt like the body was a tomb, you might not do the work of cultivation and virtue and training, right? But if you feel like the body is a tomb, you might do that work and suddenly it's not a tomb, right? So there's something about that error that can actually lead one toward the absolute, to use that term. And you know, I think that's interesting. But yes, all about the lightning's bad, so I'll try. But it's all about a state of being that unveils a possibility of unfolding that I think is unveiled in the hip hop cipher. It is unveiled in Geopedia. It is unveiled and that is the beautiful, without which I think global pluralism is in big trouble. And there's more to say, but you're all wonderful. Thank you for being here. I will run and make sure that the lightning doesn't get me. Thank you all.